My name is Cristian Murilla, and I'm an industrial engineer. I have around 6 years of experience in the HR side. I am the help desk manager and international business of BYA Consulting. And today I'm here to introduce you to one of our newest tools, which is called Safe Behavioral DNA. So, the idea is to be able to review the Safe Behavioral DNA model. The main objectives has to do with the reduction of occupational accidents. This is due to the damage generated in economic terms, which is quite significant. Let's calculate. The accidents represent about 4% of world GDP, and that is without counting the family, human impact, and profitability of companies. According to the investigation, it said that most of the accidents have a causative element that is associated with the human factor. So now we will go deeper into this element, which is quite repeated in the field of safety. We start by doing an investigation setting the occupational accident rate as an objective behavior. After that, we did a literature review in terms of the research available at the scientific level that could establish relationships between accidents rate and human factors, specifically psychological factors. So we review about 50 investigations, and we're able to systemize about 20 human factors that were linked to this greater or lesser accident rate. All this based on the revised research of countries of the Asian, European, American continents, and something that we could find in Africa also. Then we were able to achieve what is called the state of the art, in terms of knowing what the state of science is about this matter. After that, we were able to create a preliminary instrument to be able to apply it into two extreme groups. A group of people with accidents of 559 and 260 employees without accidents in the last 2 years. After that, we generated profiles in order to be able to identify the differences in the responses of each of them, and in the scores finally generating the difference between them. After that, we generate profiles in order to be able to identify the differences in the responses of each of them, and in the scores, finally generating the Safe Behavioral DNA model, a tool for selection and evaluation of personnel that allows pointing to the reduction of occupational accidents. In order to understand, it is important to know what is the meaning of personality. The personality, we all have heard, we know more or less, but mainly it points to a pattern of behavior that characterizes the reaction of an individual to the environment. It's a group of features and traits that influence or help explain an individual behavior. We all, of course, have a specific personality already determined. Personality is created by the combination of traits, which are tendencies to act or feel in a certain way in given circumstances that differentiate one person from another. The traits are stable and measurable. So we understand that the safe behavioral is a predictive test that measures the individual probability of performing safely and not suffering accidents at work. The model is based on 4 factors, of which we have concentration, compliance, self-control, and prudence. These 4 factors are composed of 10 dimensions: attention to details, caution, adherence to standards, among others. Let's check them one by one. I will start with the concentration factor. It's composed of attention to detail and caution. Attention to detail is related to prolixity, with care, with a low distraction rate. The most careful people are more organized and will be less likely to get hurt compared to less careful people. Caution is associated with introversion and openness. More introverted people get less injuries, mainly because they pay more attention to details. They are more withdrawn and are more attentive to look at things, despite of an outgoing person who talks more, is more concerned with social environment, and loses track of things. This is supported by multiple international researchers that have been able to establish a relationship between introversion-extroversion versus accident rate. On the other hand, being open also has to do with creativity. The most creative people are more likely to get injured than the less creative people. This is, once more, quite sustained in terms of research and the logic behind its thinking about positions in the functions that are being fulfilled, for example, in an industry that have more routines and more monotonous, and where the person cannot skip procedures. So, more creative people will be likely to skip those procedures by trying to apply creativity, as this is their main trait. Then, attention to detail and caution generates the concentration factor. An example has to do with their driving vehicles, where small distractions can lead to fatal accidents. A 1 ms distraction can cause a huge accident. The second factor is compliance with standards, that is composed of 3 dimensions: adherence to standards, social integration, and security control. Adherence to norms or to standards has to do with social adjustment and respect for norms. There are people who are more or less attached to the rules in general. People less attached to the norms in general will tend to be less attached to the safety norms. Then, of course, they'll be more exposed to accidents at work by not following the company's safety guidelines. Social integration has to do with altruism, with kindness. The more altruistic people are less injured than more selfish people. And the clearest example may be a bus driver who carries passengers. Being more altruistic, of course, will be more concerned with its own safety and the safety of its passengers, and won't take greater risk, that is, will not take unnecessary risk. For example, being more careful in speeding, among others. Finally, security control has to do with the control locus. The control locus is a psychological construct that goes from external to internal. People with external control locus tend to blame fate, chance, or luck for what happens in their personal lives, and specifically for work-related accidents. While people with internal control locus tend to assume responsibility for their own in terms of occupational accidents prevention. So, those 3 dimensions generate the compliance factor. Well, there we have an example of quite clear situations regarding lack of compliance and regulations, among other features on the image. The third factor is self-control. It's composed of 3 dimensions: anxiety management, emotional stability, and stress tolerance. Anxiety management has to do with being, of course, more anxious. Anxiety is a natural biological reaction of the human being to situations of threat. To the extent that there is no objective threat situation, obviously a more complex situation would be generated in terms of anxiety. Then people who have better anxiety management will tend to be less injured than the people with poor anxiety management. Emotional stability is another dimension, which has to do with self-control factor. People with greater instability would tend to be more injured. And finally, stress tolerance, which is the ability to cope with stress situations. The handling of these types of situations are understanding that a large part of current job functions are exposed to a stress situation. Having the ability to handle them properly would be a protective factor in this regard, and people with greater greater tolerance to stress will tend to be less injured than others in an inverse situation. An example of this factor is the case of Andrea Lubitz. He was a co-pilot of an European airline called Germanwings. And on a flight from Barcelona to Dusseldorf, he decided to commit suicide, and with him, taking the life of 150 people who were on board on March 24 of 2015. This person had, of course, certain complex psychological traits. He was being medicated and had been diagnosed by a psychiatrist as an unstable person. A diagnosis which, of course, the airline didn't deliver at the time of the expert's report. On the internet, you can find more information about this case because it was quite terrible. But according to what appears at the investigation, just before he made the decision to commit suicide, he was under a critical situation in economic, emotional terms, among others. Triggered by his previous instability, he generated a rather complex situation since he plans his suicide. So in terms of self-control and the importance of that factor and its impact on occupational accidents, and finally, prudence, which has to do with impulse control and risk rejection. The most impulsive people tend to be more injured than people who don't react immediately, who think more about things, who have a more reflective behavior. And a risk rejection is a search for new sensations, reckless behavior. There are people who have that need to experience new sensations, whether it's parachute jumping or speeding, for example. If it were a bus driver with these characteristics, he would seek to experience that adrenaline that he needs. Well, here's a fairly illustrative example of what we are talking about, where reckless behavior is being carried out in the workplace. The model is oriented to the application for selection and evaluation of personnel. It takes about 25 minutes to respond, and the report is provided immediately. It's online and meets the guidelines of non-discrimination in terms of gender and age. It has a reliability index of 0.93 according to the calculated Cronbach alpha. The report is presented according to the traffic light colors, which means low is a low probability of safe behavior, and green is high probability of safe behavior. There are three types of results for the report. First, we have the core, which corresponds to the final global score, which is safe behavior DNA, which presents the probability of safe behavior in the workplace. The inner ring, which represents the results of 4 factors, and the outer ring, which are the 10 related and grouped dimensions for each of the factors. Depending on the results provided for selection and evaluation, an interpretation of the scores for use in company is generated. Well, in this case, we are comparing 3,512 candidates who have been evaluated where the accident rate of the last 5 years was compared, where the low probability group of safe behavior represents almost 18% in occupational accidents, while the high probability group of safe behavior only presented 8.6. In percentage terms, the group with the highest risk, that is, low probability of safe behavior, presents 108% more risk than the group of high probability of safe behavior, considering 3,512 cases in Latin American only. The same exercise was carried out with current employees evaluated from different companies, considering 3,756 people, where the low probability group of safety or risk behavior would have an accident rate of 37%, versus the high probability group of safe behavior corresponding to 18%. In percentage terms, the difference is 106. This is mainly what we're interested in sharing with you. I hope it has been useful. There are contact emails. Contact us if you need further information. If you have any questions, please send them to the email also, and we will answer as soon as we can. You can also request a free demo of this tool through our contact emails or go to our website www.safebehavioral.com. Thanks a lot for your time. See you soon.